Every single morning, long before the golden sun had even thought about casting its first warm rays across the waking city of Calabar, the unrelenting rhythm of life on Atacong Lane had already begun. The air, heavy with humidity, and the intermingled scents of diesel fumes and frying palm oil throbbed with an energy that was both chaotic and predictable. It was a place where the extremes of human existence didn't just meet. They collided day after brutal day, in a spectacle that most people had grown too exhausted or too indifferent to witness. The roads were already choked, vast rivers of steel and exhaust, barely moving as vehicles sat bumper to bumper. Frustrated drivers, their tempers fraying like the worn fabric of their seats, pressed down on their horns again and again, contributing to a deafening chorus of desperation that seemed to echo the unspoken anxieties of everyone trapped within this concrete maze. Traders on the roadside didn't just call out. They hollered, their voices competing against the din as they tried to attract the attention of commuters who were far too focused on their own daily battles to notice. People moved in frantic waves, a blur of tired faces and hurried steps, all caught up in the same endless race against time and circumstance. Striking almost violent contrast to this scene of struggle was the inside of a massive, sleek SUV that had sat motionlessly behind the steering wheel for nearly 10 minutes. Inside this sanctuary of leather and silence there sat a woman named Emma. She was young, barely past 30, yet she carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who was accustomed to being in control. While one hand rested lightly on the wheel, the other, adorned with rings that probably cost more than a roadside trader made in a lifetime, lay casually beside her, a testament to her world of comfort. She had stopped fighting morning traffic years ago, recognizing it as an immutable force. Instead of getting upset, she simply waited, watching the chaos unfold around her through the tinted glass, a safe distance from the struggle she observed. For Emma was not just anyone. She was the only daughter of Madame Adara, a name that commanded respect, and often envy, throughout the city. Years earlier, her mother had taken a small, unassuming family business, and through grit and opportunity, had built an empire, handing the reins over to her daughter when she decided to take a step back and guide. Emma now managed everything, living a life that was beyond the wildest dreams of the people fighting to survive just inches from her car window. She was wealthy, yes, but more than that, she was isolated, cocooned by her wealth and her silence, a silence that she didn't even realize she was trapped within. But that morning, as she waited at the junction, her gaze was drawn to something that she normally wouldn't have given a second thought. It was an elderly man, moving with agonizing slowness along the very edge of the busy road in a dilapidated wheelchair. His clothes were not just old, they were worn from years of exposure to the elements and indifference. The rubber on his sandals looked too old to even be called sandals anymore, and his hair, white and matted, added to his air of absolute abandonment. Yet, what Emma found herself watching was not just his poverty, but the determination etched into the deep lines of his face as his trembling hands pushed the wheelchair forward. He seemed to embody a strange kind of invisible persistence, moving with a focus that was both heartbreaking and mesmerizing. Something about him, perhaps his complete and utter solitude in a world that ignored him, held Emma's attention. Her eyes remained fixed on him as he approached the first small food spot at the junction, a busy stall where workers stopped for breakfast. The woman behind the counter looked up, and for a fleeting, hopeful second, the elderly man paused. Then, in a casual display of cruelty that left a knot in Emma's stomach, the woman picked up a bowl of water, and without a single word, threw it toward him. The water splashed across the dusty ground, barely missing his wheelchair. People looked, some even snickered, but nobody said a word. The elderly man remained silent, the only expression on his face a slight hardening of his gaze before he laboriously turned his wheelchair around to move toward the next food spot. And at the next stop, things were even worse. The woman there didn't just dismiss him. She grabbed a long stick from behind her counter and actively chased him out with it, her voice filled with a disgust that made Emma's skin crawl. A few customers laughed, finding amusement in the humiliation of a man who already had nothing. Emma felt a heavy, uncomfortable weight settle inside her chest, a mixture of anger and a sadness she didn't quite understand. She did not know this man, yet witnessing him be treated in a way that stripped him of his humanity felt profoundly wrong, a raw injustice that she couldn't just dismiss. She watched as he began to move away, the picture of defeat, but then as he rolled past a small, simple food spot just a short distance away, everything changed. This place was different from the others, much smaller and more basic. A simple wooden counter stood in front, and a few faded plastic chairs were clustered under a worn umbrella that offered only minimal shade. It was a scene of honest hard work. Standing outside was a woman who was clearly the owner, her apron dusted with flour and a tired but gentle expression on her face. Amidst the morning rush, with customers waiting for their food and food cooking behind her, she had stopped everything to do something extraordinary. She raised her hand toward the retreating man, calling out to him. Emma watched carefully, her curiosity piqued. The elderly man turned his wheelchair around, staring at the woman for a few seconds, as if he was not sure she was actually talking to him. Slowly he moved his wheelchair back toward her small food spot. When he reached her, the woman went inside for a moment. When she returned, she was carrying a food pack, and in a simple yet profoundly kind act, she opened it and meticulously filled it with food from her pots, ensuring it was full before closing the container and handing it to him with a smile. The elderly man's hands trembled as he accepted the simple meal, and a look of deep gratitude softened his worn face, and for the first time since Emma had been watching him, a genuine smile appeared. He moved away with his meal, and the woman immediately returned to her customers, as if nothing special had happened, as if she had not just become the only person that morning who treated that man like a human being. The profound impact of that fleeting interaction stayed with Emma long after the traffic finally began to move, long after she had turned into the lane leading to her magnificent office building. The image of the woman's simple act of compassion, performed with such humility in the face of widespread indifference, refused to leave her mind. For Emma, who rarely saw such unadorned kindness in her world of calculated transactions and superficiality, it was a moment that had quietly and irrevocably unsettled something deep within her. It made her question her own comfort, her own insulation from the realities that existed just beyond her daily routine. And as she arrived at her corner office, filled with important decisions and urgent meetings, the memory of that morning at Atacong Lane, of the elderly man and the kind food seller, continued to echo. She had more money than she could ever spend, but seeing that simple act of kindness had left her with a nagging question that she couldn't answer. Who were they? And why did this particular story feel like it was only just beginning to unfold? And why did she have a premonition that seeing that morning was not a simple act of chance, but the prelude to an event that would turn her carefully constructed world completely upside down? Over the course of the next 2 weeks, the routine at the junction of Atacong Lane seemed to freeze in a pattern that grew increasingly intense, fueled by a simmering conflict that the roadside traders themselves were actively escalating. The central figure in this escalating drama, besides the gentle food seller Eno, was a woman named Gladys, the wealthy and prideful owner of the largest food spot on the corner. Gladys was a woman who measured human worth solely by the thickness of a person's wallet and the cleanliness of their clothes. Her stall was always bustling with high-paying civil servants and corporate workers, and she fiercely guarded this affluent clientele. To Gladys, the daily appearance of the elderly man in his squeaking, rusted wheelchair was not just an eyesore. It was a direct threat to her business, a nuisance that threatened to drive away her wealthy customers. She watched with growing malice every morning as Eno, despite her own financial struggles and the tiny size of her wooden stall, would pause her entire operation to hand a warm, freshly packed meal to the beggar. Gladys couldn't comprehend it. In her mind, kindness was a waste of resources, and feeding a disabled man who couldn't pay was an act of absolute foolishness. She began a subtle but vicious campaign to rid the junction of the old man once and for all, rallying the other nearby vendors who were eager to please the most powerful trader on the lane. They began to actively block the old man's path, whispering insults just loud enough for him to hear, and intentionally making the atmosphere hostile. Yet, no matter how harsh the environment became, Eno stood as a solitary shield for the vulnerable man. Every time Gladys or her allies tried to humiliate him, Eno would step forward, her voice calm but unyielding, reminding them that everyone deserved to eat and be treated with dignity. This only served to infuriate Gladys further, turning her corporate pride into a deeply personal vendetta against the small-time food seller who dared to challenge her authority. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Thursday morning, under a sky that threatened rain, but only delivered a suffocating heat that made everyone's temper incredibly short. The traffic was backed up for miles, a stagnant gridlock of vehicles that included Emma's luxury SUV, positioned perfectly across the street to witness the entire confrontation. The elderly man was slowly making his way toward Eno's stall, his face pale and his breathing labored from the intense heat. Before he could reach the safety of the faded umbrella, Gladys stepped out from behind her massive counter, her face contorted in a sneer of pure arrogance. She stood directly in his path, flanked by two of her loyal kitchen assistants. In a loud, theatrical voice designed to draw the attention of the entire street, Gladys began to humiliate the old man, accusing him of bringing bad luck to the junction and demanding that he take his filth elsewhere. The old man froze, his hands gripping the rusted wheels of his chair, his eyes lowered in a painful attempt to maintain whatever dignity he had left. A few bystanders, caught up in the cruelty of the spectacle, began to jeer. Hearing the commotion, Eno dropped her serving spoon and rushed out from her stall, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness. She placed herself between the aggressive crowd and the elderly man, pleading with Gladys to leave him alone and offering to pay for any space he was supposedly taking up. This display of selflessness was exactly what Gladys wanted to crush. With a cruel, triumphant laugh, Gladys claimed that Eno's cheap food stall was ruining the reputation of the entire lane anyway, and before anyone could react, she forcefully pushed the elderly man's wheelchair backward. The rusted wheel caught on a deep pothole in the asphalt, and with a sickening crunch the wheelchair flipped, throwing the fragile old man violently onto the hard, dusty ground. The food container Eno had given him the day before fell from his lap, its contents spilling into the dirt. A collective gasp rippled through the immediate crowd, but Gladys merely folded her arms, a look of smug satisfaction on her face, as if she had successfully cleared a piece of trash from her porch. Eno let out a cry of genuine anguish and immediately dropped to her knees in the dirt, completely ignoring the dust and the mocking stares of Gladys's customers. She carefully cradled the old man's head, checking his fragile limbs for injuries, while tears of hot anger and deep empathy streamed down her face. The injustice was so raw, so palpable, that even the heavy morning air seemed to grow still with a collective sense of shame. From across the street, inside the quiet isolation of her car, Emma felt a sudden, violent surge of emotion that she had never experienced in her entire life. She watched Eno tenderly wipe the dirt from the old man's face, defending him against the sneers of a woman who thought her money gave her the right to crush the weak. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her wealthy isolation shattered by a profound realization of the cruelty that existed in the world, and a growing, unstoppable urge to intervene. She watched as Eno, with the help of a kind-hearted passerby, laboriously lifted the old man back into his damaged wheelchair, her small frame shaking but her spirit entirely unbroken. Gladys turned back to her shop, loudly declaring her victory to her customers, and boasting that the beggar would never dare return to her side of the road again. It was a moment of profound, heartbreaking injustice, a scene where the villain celebrated an act of pure malice while the kind-hearted hero suffered in silence, clinging tightly to her principles despite the cost. And as Emma finally managed to drive away from the clearing traffic, her mind was no longer focused on her corporate meetings or her family empire. The image of Eno kneeling in the dirt, protecting a man who had nothing, had ignited a spark of fierce determination inside her. The conflict at the junction had reached a point of no return, and the secret observation of the wealthy heiress was about to transform from a passive gaze into a powerful force that would shake the very foundations of Atacong Lane, setting off a chain reaction that would ensure that every single act of cruelty witnessed that morning would be answered with an equally powerful, life-altering reckoning. Following the brutal incident at the junction, the situation for Eno deteriorated rapidly as Gladys sought to capitalize on her cruel victory and drive her competitor out of business entirely. Gladys, fueled by an insatiable pride, used her influence with the local market association and corrupt street wardens to make Eno's life an absolute living hell. She fabricated lies, claiming that Eno's small stall was a health hazard and that she was harboring vagrants who threatened the safety of high-paying customers. Within days, heavy-handed wardens began harassing Eno, demanding exorbitant, impossible fees just for her to keep her faded umbrella standing by the roadside. They intentionally overturned her plastic chairs and threatened to confiscate her cooking pots, trying to break her spirit. Meanwhile, Gladys openly celebrated her malicious dominance, gloating to her wealthy corporate clientele and laughing loudly whenever Ino struggled to serve her loyal but poor customers through the chaos. Yet despite the worsening pressure, Ino stubbornly refused to compromise on her principles. Every morning, with trembling hands but an unbreakable heart, she still prepared an extra, carefully packed warm meal, keeping an eye out for the elderly man who had gone into hiding out of fear. The viewers could feel a deep, burning sense of frustration and injustice at the sight of the villain thriving, while the kind-hearted hero faced complete financial ruin. But what Gladys did not realize was that her brazen acts of cruelty were being meticulously documented. Across the road, hidden behind the heavily tinted windows of her parked luxury vehicle, Emma was no longer just a passive witness. She had initiated a secret, high-stakes investigation. Emma had deployed her corporate security team and legal advisors to quietly gather evidence of Gladys's illegal extortion, her corrupt connections with the wardens, and the systematic abuse of the street's most vulnerable citizens. Emma remained completely invisible to the traders, a silent billionaire pulling strings from the shadows, her anger transforming into a cold, calculated strategy for justice. Tension built to a fever pitch as Gladys, completely blinded by her arrogance, planned a final, devastating blow to demolish Ino's wooden counter permanently on the upcoming weekend. The emotional descriptions of Gladys's smug, remorseless face as she counted her daily profits contrasted sharply with Ino's quiet tears of exhaustion over her boiling pots, building an intense suspense that left viewers eagerly awaiting the moment the truth would be revealed and the villain would finally face an unstoppable reckoning. Saturday morning arrived with a suffocating tension that seemed to hang over Atacong Lane like a heavy storm cloud. Gladys stood outside her sprawling food spot, her face twisted into a triumphant, ugly sneer as she directed 3 uniformed street wardens toward Ino's small wooden stall. She had paid them handsomely to permanently smash Ino's counter to pieces, and a crowd of onlookers gathered, whispering in fear as Ino stood alone, tears streaming down her face, desperately shielding her cooking pots with her own body. Gladys laughed loudly, mocking Ino's poverty, and screaming that no one was coming to save a worthless roadside seller. But just as the lead warden raised a heavy crowbar to shatter Ino's counter, the screech of tires silenced the entire junction. 3 black luxury SUVs and a marked police escort vehicle pulled up, completely blocking the road. The doors flew open, and a team of sharp-dressed corporate lawyers, security personnel, and high-ranking municipal officers stepped out, followed by Emma, who looked incredibly powerful and elegant. The crowd gasped as Emma walked directly past the stunned wardens and stood right beside Ino, gently putting a comforting arm around her shaking shoulders. Gladys's smug smile instantly froze, her face draining of all color as she recognized Emma as the billionaire heiress of the Idara Empire, the very landlord who owned the entire commercial strip of Atacong Lane. Emma didn't waste a single second. She signaled her lawyers, who stepped forward and presented official, binding documents directly to the terrified wardens, instantly exposing their corruption and stripping them of their badges on the spot. Emma then turned her piercing, icy gaze directly onto Gladys, announcing before the entire street that Gladys's lease was permanently revoked, her business was seized, and she was being sued for extortion, assault, and systemic harassment. Panic and absolute humiliation washed over Gladys as she realized her entire life was crumbling. In a matter of seconds, she dropped to her knees in the dusty dirt, desperately weeping, begging Emma for mercy and trying to apologize to Ino, but it was far too late for excuses. Justice triumphed completely as the crowd erupted into cheers, watching the arrogant villain exposed and utterly ruined, while the gentle, tearful Ino was completely vindicated and lifted high by the very billionaire who had been watching from the shadows all along. The final consequences of that fateful Saturday morning shook Atacong Lane to its very foundations, delivering a swift and brutal lesson in karma that the entire city of Calabar would talk about for years to come. For Gladys, the fall from grace was absolute and unyielding. Within a matter of weeks, her commercial empire completely collapsed under the weight of mounting legal fees, exposed corruption, and the loss of her business lease. Stripped of her wealth and abandoned by the fair-weather customers who once fed her arrogance, she was forced into exile from the commercial district, sinking into the very poverty and obscurity she had so deeply despised in others. Meanwhile, Ino's life was beautifully and permanently transformed. Backed by Emma and the immense resources of the Idara family, her small roadside food stall was replaced by a modern, beautiful and fully equipped restaurant building that became a sanctuary of good food and genuine community. More than just a business, it became a symbol of hope, where the elderly man, now revealed to be Emma's long-lost father, Okan, was fully cared for. Successfully undergoing the medical surgeries he needed to finally stand and walk on his own 2 feet again. This touching journey leaves us with a powerful, undeniable truth. Every choice we make in this life is a seed planted in the soil of destiny, and karma never forgets a face. Eno simply chose to feed a hungry man when the rest of the world pushed him away, never looking for praise, hidden wealth, or reward. Yet that one simple act of kindness unlocked a miracle that reunited a broken family and transformed her own life forever. Never look down on anyone because of their current situation, for you never know the hidden storms they are fighting or the angels watching from the shadows. Now, we want to hear from you. What part of this emotional story touched your heart the most? And what did it teach you about the power of loyalty and kindness? Please share your deep thoughts in the comment section below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on